Somebody posted a comment on one of my other videos asking how I finish my resin spheres. I went back to look and I realized I don't have just a simple overview of what are all the steps, including the finishing. So what this video is going to cover are just basically the basic steps that I go through all the way through to creating the sphere. But when I get to the piece where I'm doing the finishing, I'll do it in a little bit more detail, just so you can see exactly how I do that and some of the lessons that I've learned and some of the equipment that I use to do that. These are some examples. This one isn't resin, just a nice size sphere, but I did use the same mechanism for sanding it. I didn't wet sand that one. And these are sort of more typical pieces that I've made that are finished fairly well. This one's actually quite an early piece that I did, and you can see it's got pieces inside of it. I wasn't so good with my keeping dust out of the resin. This one's a little bit better. So anyway, let me walk through the steps. So what I do is I start with cutting a piece of, I use 5/4 pine, so this is 5/4 pine, so it's actually an inch thick as it's finished. And I cut that just using one of these saws to create a 4-inch piece of wood. And then I buy this is land drain. It's got like a double-edged land drain. Get it from Home Depot. What's nice about this is, first of all, it's very inexpensive, it's very light. And the black plastic inside doesn't stick to the resin. So I use this as my mold. I don't even use mold release on this because it comes off so nicely. So what I do is I cut a piece of this. This is probably, maybe 7 inches. And what I then do is I take the piece of 5/4 pine and I mount it in the bottom of this is the 5/4 inch piece of pine, and I mount it in the bottom of this pipe. So I put this in here. This tape is an aluminium tape, or aluminum tape if you're in America. Aluminium tape that they use when they're doing duct work for air conditioning. And I like it because it molds really well to the shape. So it tends to be quite sort of waterproof, or in this case resin proof. So I've got the piece of the wood in there. I make sure that this is as sort of at 90 degrees to the base as possible. So I spend a lot of time making sure that this is at 90 degrees so that when it gets mounted on the lathe, then it's spinning sort of nice and centrally. I put the tape around, and then a lesson I learned, I always have some of these undone, and what I do is when I'm doing some of the resin work, I pour just about sort of, like 1/8 of an inch, 1/4 of an inch of resin into the bottom of this. So this one's ready to be used, and the bottom is sealed. The reason I do that is, before I used to do that, when I did the resin pour inside of here, bubbles would get would have been stuck in here, and in the pressure pot they could ooze up, and some of them could actually ooze into the center. So I did find that really just makes the whole thing completely watertight. So this is, say, a piece of land pipe, 5/4 inch. You could use a different size. Sorry, the compressor just came on. 5/4 inch in the bottom, sealed with a bit of aluminium tape, a little bit of resin in the bottom. So I have half a dozen of these sat around at any time, ready to use. So then what you're going to do is you're going to put whatever you want to put inside of here and fill it up. This is going to create a 3.5 inch. Well, this is going to create a 4-inch mold, which will be about a 3.5 inch sphere. So make sure you put at least 4 inches. I usually go to about 4.5, even 5 inches in here, because you want some spare at the bottom. So don't be stingy on how much you put in here. But basically, you're going to fill this with whatever you're going to fill it with. Just Nick Zametti would fill it with something really bizarre, but I typically use things that I manufacture myself, or things to order even. So here's an example of one that I've taken out of a mold, and this was actually a prototype that I was working on for something that someone commissioned me to make, and it was Smaug the dragon from Lord of the Rings sitting on a gold mountain. So the mountain in this, I took a piece of, looks like black walnut, I'm going to guess. I put it in my CNC, and this is actually the same shape as Mount Everest. So this isn't some kind of beautiful natural burl. It actually is Mount Everest. And I stuck this thing on there. I didn't center it very well, which is why this is why I'm going to use this for this, because it's not going to be perfect. But you can see this has come straight out of this mold, or one of these molds. I just, you know, once it's set in the pressure pot, I just run a craft knife down and just peel it open, and you end up with this. So you even still see the aluminium tape on the bottom. So then there's the piece of wood. As I say, actually this is probably, yeah, this was probably nearly full, which is not, you know, is the right thing to do, because what I'm going to do is when I create the sphere, I'm going to center it probably just sort of close to the bottom of the piece that's in there, and it's going to really magnify that. So just be aware when you create something like this, that model is like 3/4 of an inch big. It's tiny, but it gets magnified. So, you know, if you're ever around somewhere and you see really detailed small models that are about 1/2 inch size, buy them, because you'll love them in these spheres. So this is ready to mount on the lathe. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to mount this on the lathe, and then I'm going to rough turn it to a sphere shape, and then I'm going to use my jig to actually turn it into the sphere. So we'll move over to the lathe, and I'll probably just skip to showing you each of those steps just so that you can see them until we get to the sanding piece. So I want to run through a couple of things that are important once it's on the lathe. The first thing is I use these templates to rough turn to the sphere shape. I have another video on these, including different size templates in a PDF file that is linked to from the video. So if you want these, just go and find that other video. If I remember, I'll put a link in below. One thing to think about here is this is the center point. This is going to be the sort of effectively the equator of the piece. So you need to work out what is it you want in here to be centered in the finished piece. And there's a few things to think about. First of all, you know, what's the focal point, but also how much of the, in this case, the wood, you know, the gold, and then the resin do you want. You know, if I put it here, the top half is almost entirely resin, which, you know, okay. If I sort of move down a little bit, then I'm going to sort of just line this center point up with pretty much the bottom of the piece that's in there. That's going to get me a nice amount of the wood, the gold, and everything. So I'm going to use that. So I just need to mark the parameters. So I've got, this is going to be the bottom. This will be this piece. That's the center line. This bit. And here, and it doesn't need to be, you know, doesn't need to be super accurate, but it's going to tell me when I start cutting now, you know, what can I lose. So, you know, I can lose all of everything to the right of this line. This side here, I'm going to have to cut in, making sure I don't hit the screws that are holding the chuck on, as always. And then this is where I'm going to do my 45-degree pieces just to get the rough turn, and then I'll take those edges off. The center line isn't terribly important. But I just marked it on there just to show you. The most important thing, if you're cutting resin, I use carbide bits. I'm pretty lazy. I use carbide bits pretty much for everything. If you're using a carbide bit with resin, then get this negative rake. I don't know how well you can see that, but it's not a sharp edge. It actually sort of slopes down. The negative rake cuts resin beautifully. I mean, it will come off in ribbons. It's fantastic. If you use a regular sort of, you know, sharp square carbide bit, it chips. It sort of almost shatters in pieces, and you get all these bits off. You can do it, but you know, these things are not cheap. But then, you know, none of the carbide bits are cheap. It just makes all the difference in the world. I even have one for the jig that I use, so you'll see me using it on there. So definitely a top tip. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to cut this down to the shape of the template. We'll stop, take another look at it, and then we'll move on to the next steps. Okay, so this beautiful mess is the rough turned sphere. I had to take the tailstock off to get right in there, but hopefully you can see it's pretty close. And then what I'll do now is I'll just knock these edges off, just because it saves me having to do more on the jig. You know, and this is close enough. This is actually quite a nice proportion. So what I'll do, I'll knock these corners off. I'll mount the jig, show you sort of how it works with the jig. Although I have other videos all the way through, some sort of unboxing the jig to using it, and we'll get ourselves to the actual sphere that's still attached here. And you can see I've cleaned this out quite a lot because I just know from experience that the jig needs to be able to sort of come around into here. So I try and take as much off here as I can, but still leaving enough of a base for it to be strong, because it can be under a little bit of tension when it's on the jig, but also just watching out, make sure I don't hit those the screws in here, which is why I like to use the thicker base. So let me get the corners knocked off and get the jig set up, and I'll show you what that looks like. So you can see I've knocked the edges off just to make it, you know, a little bit closer to spherical, and I've mounted the jig, and I have plenty of videos on the jig to show you how to use it, but basically what you can see is the jig just goes back and forth like this, and each time we do that, I turn this wheel, and that moves the bit down a little bit further, and basically it's just going to go back and forth like this, quarter of a turn at a time, and it's going to basically turn this into a sphere and just leave it attached to the headstock. So again, want to see that, plenty of other videos on it, so I'm going to skip to what that looks like. It's probably going to take me 15-20 minutes. It's pretty quick. In fact, this whole thing's probably only taken me half an hour so far, if that, even with stopping to do videos. Once you get the hang of it, if you've got the right tools, it doesn't take too long. So let me skip to the sphere being finished but still attached to the headstock, because that's when I think some of the experience that I have can help you with how do you get it off the headstock, how do you then finish it, and then how do you actually sand it down to the last piece. I think those are the things that probably where I've learned most of the lessons and might help you the most. Okay, so here's it turned on the jig, and you can see that's pretty spherical. There's some wavy lines there, but they're not very deep, and that just seems to happen. The jig chatters a little bit. I think possibly this arm's, you know, just not quite as good as it could be, so you just get a little bit of chattering. It's also possible that the bit needs replacing or turning. But anyway, nothing there that would concern me. In fact, it'll be a good exercise in showing you how to sand it out. Now, what we need to do now is we need to remove it from the base. So I don't have a particularly good sort of imagination or ability to sort of envision things, so I'm very careful here. What I don't want to do is cut it too close, because then I'll end up with a flat bottom. That's not good. And also, if I cut it too far away, then I've just got a lot of work to do to get rid of the piece that's going to be left. So I actually go back to my jig, and you can see this is, I didn't take very much off. So this is pretty close. So that black line, I want that black line to still be there when I've finished cutting this off. So what I'll do, I'll use a parting bit, and I'll take it most of the way off to the left of that black line. And then I'll just use a saw just to cut it off, and then I'll come back and show you, and this is where I think it starts getting interesting. How do I then finish this piece off, and then how do we do the sanding? Okay, so here's the piece cut off, and you can see I sort of got it down to something close, certainly larger than the sphere, and then I just cut it off badly using a thin saw. That's the piece that was left on the lathe. I want to run through the equipment that I use moving onwards, and this is where, I do have the advantage of having some, not terribly expensive, but some specialty equipment, and that is a vacuum chuck. So what I have here is a vacuum pump. This is from Harbor Freight. I think it's used for air conditioning and things typically. So a vacuum, and then it runs through a hose to, I bought this and it didn't actually work very well, so I kind of rebuilt it myself. But basically the tube comes from the vacuum pump, comes into here, and then this tube here goes to the vacuum chuck, which I'll show you on the lathe in a minute. And this switch here allows me to, basically this opens this valve, so this is now just basically sucking a vacuum from the air. When I flick it up here, it starts pulling the vacuum from the chuck, and this is important because it basically allows me to release the chuck and reconnect the chuck really easily, and you'll see why that's important in a minute, and you'll understand why I'm belaboring this point. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to put the vacuum chuck onto the lathe, show you what that looks like on the lathe, and then I'll show you how we use it to turn this to be you know, to get rid of the nubbin that's left, and then also how I use it to sand, and that's where it's I think most useful. Okay, let me show you how the vacuum chuck comes together. So this is the blue pipe. Blue tube comes from the vacuum pump, and then it goes through the headstock, comes out the other end. So the vacuum is being sucked into here, and this cup goes on the end. They do different size cups. I actually only have this one. It's pretty much all I've ever used, although I'm sure it can be useful for bowls and things if you have the larger one. I just use a Jacob's chuck for that. So inside here there's a rubber seal, which actually I need to replace at some point. And that's going to be important when we come to the sanding. But basically, with the vacuum on, actually I'm going to wet this. It definitely works better when this is a little bit wet, which is fine when you're working with resin. I'm going to turn the vacuum on, and then I'm going to turn on my little sort of unit down there so that it starts sucking the vacuum, and you'll see it actually grab hold of this. So it's actually holding it there pretty securely. Probably, no, actually I would struggle to pull that off. So that's held on there nicely. And then I also have this thing that I've put together, and basically that's going to also hold it from that side as well. Just gives it a little bit of extra support. Now I'm going to turn the vacuum chuck off just so you can hear me. I would typically leave it running. So what we're going to do here is, you can see this is held in here. Actually, it's actually about exactly the right spot. You know, with it here, I can actually turn this piece off. But the key thing is to make sure this is really centered. Otherwise, what you're going to do is you're going to be turning a slightly different shape here than the rest of the sphere, and you'll end up with something that is not going to be exact. And it's amazing how you can tell even when it's a little bit out. So what I do is I pretty much just sort of do it by hand now, but I'll just put this here, and I'm just going to run my finger here, and okay, actually, so it's actually pretty much, it's a little bit out, maybe half a mil out. I probably wouldn't normally adjust it, but what I can do is basically I can sort of just tap it and get it absolutely so that when I run my finger around here, it's touching, actually, yeah, it's touching here a little bit more. Yeah, it's touching here. Well, I'd expect it to touch here more because it's of that piece, but actually it's pretty much exactly out as I want it. And then I would just tighten everything down, check it again. I'd have the I will have the vacuum on. And then there's two ways to approach this. What I typically do is just use my regular carbide tools, and very, very gently as it's turning, all I want to do is basically turn this piece off. Another way of doing it, which I've actually had success with, is actually to sand it off. So using some kind of sanding tool, you can then do it without actually having the lathe running at full speed. Let me just show you for 1 second. Okay, so we have it turned, and now it's ready to be sanded. What I used to do originally was to sand it off board. So this really helps if you have a lathe where the headstock will turn. And what I would do is, using the vacuum chuck, basically mount it on here, sand it, stop the chuck, turn the vacuum to sort of vent, randomly put it back in again, put the vacuum back on, and turn it. And what I ended up with was I would end up completely covered in in sort of detritus, as would everything sort of in this line. And I put plastic down, and it's just what I did, and I did that for the longest time. And then I came up with this highly sophisticated, built within massive tolerances solution. I'm thinking of doing a patent on this. I'm sure I can make millions. So let me I'm going to pick this up by hand and show you how this incredible piece of engineering works. Give me 1 second. So what we have is a Home Depot bucket, and I've just cut out a notch, as you can tell, within thousandths of an inch tolerance. So basically the vacuum chuck is sitting inside the bucket, and what I can do now is actually nicely, I can rinse this off between things. I'm going to put it on the vacuum chuck, it'll be spinning, and I'm sanding it sort of with my hands inside the bucket. I have the chuck running at its slowest possible setting, and in fact what I actually do is I put it on its slowest setting, and then I have this little clamp that I use to sort of hold it down even further to get it on an even slower setting. So I put this down to its slowest setting, and then I'll clamp this around here to hold it in an even slower setting. So it's pretty safe. I don't wear my watch when I'm doing this or anything, so I feel fairly confident that I'm not going to get myself caught up. I certainly haven't. And then what happens is literally 90% of the spray is going inside the bucket. And then, change this water, especially as you get to the sort of the higher grits. Change the water, maybe as you change the paper. I don't typically do that when I'm at the first grits. But basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to start sanding inside the bucket. I'll set the camera up so you can see. It gets pretty boring. Put some music on, I'll sand, and then I'll stop after maybe 30 seconds and just turn it a little bit. And the big advantage of this approach is I'm not, on the lathe, when something's mounted, you're turning in the same plane all the time. So if you get ridges here, I'm going to sand a little bit, sand a little bit, sand a little bit, and just randomly keep turning this, and it really does. By the time you finish, there's certainly no lines on it, and it'll get rid of any of these. There's a little bit there at the top that'll just be gone with 80 grit. And I will typically, this probably doesn't need 80 grit. I'll probably start at 100, but basically I'll do 100 all the way up to 3,000 or 5,000 depending on the piece. There's not much anyway, and then I'll buff, and I'll show you the buffing piece as well. So let me get started, and then you can see what that looks like just for a couple of minutes. Okay, so the noise you can hear in the background is that's the vacuum chuck. Hoping you'll be able to see this okay. But basically, this is actually starting at 150. Typically, I'll do that for this for a little bit longer than I'm going to this time, but the routine is, you do this for a certain amount of time, stop the lathe, release the vacuum chuck, rinse it out, pop it back on again, put the vacuum on so you can see it's attached, and you might be able to see there's lines there. I'm using 150, so it's a pretty aggressive grit at this point, and I'll basically keep doing this. I'll maybe stop and start it at this kind of grit maybe 8 or 10 times, and probably do this for probably 5, 6, 7 minutes. Not that long, but when you consider sort of how much you're doing here, that's quite a lot of sanding. And as I say, the real trick here is that each time I do this, I'm changing the direction that it's turning, so you're not getting those lines that you're exacerbating. And as I say, I will do this through all the grits, and by the time I'm finished, this is going to look pretty good while it's wet, but it won't be it won't, you know, it'll be better once we've buffed it up. So anyway, I'm going to keep doing this. You don't need to stay and watch this. You get the idea. Basically, just every so often with the wet and dry, I'm going to stop it, rinse it off, pop it back on again, and just keep going. Okay, so that's sanded up to 3000 grit. And it looks pretty good. But I'll take it into the house and I'll give it a proper rinse and clean off just to see if there's any scratches anywhere. But at first blush, that looks pretty good. That gold came up nicely. The piece in the center, say this was really just a prototype for something that I made for somebody. So I'm going to take this, clean it. Now typically what I would do is I would let this dry for 2 or 3 days because there's water now in the wood piece. It doesn't go in as far as you might think, but there is water in there. But what I'm going to do, just for the sake of the video, is I'm going to set up the mandrel with the polishing pieces on, and just show you how I do that. So I get to the finished piece, and then what I'll probably do is in a few days time is I'll repolish the wood. The resin doesn't matter so much. So anyway, I'm gonna take this into the house, give it a proper clean, let it dry for a little bit, and then I'll come out, set up the mandrel and show you what that looks like. So I did actually leave it for a day, and this is it gone through to 3000 grit, and then I gave it a good clean. You can still see it's quite cloudy. There was actually a small crack in the bottom, which was a little bit unusual, which I've filled and put some CA glue onto. I'm hoping that'll be okay. If not, I'll have to sand it back down again. But the next step is to run it through the three buffing wheels. If you're not entirely familiar, the buffing wheels, the first two are actually just like much finer abrasives, so you don't want to leave that on, you know, in moving from the first wheel to the second wheel, and then certainly not to the wax. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to I focus much more on the resin, by the way. The resin takes this, you know, this kind of abrasion much better than the wood. The wood's pretty much as good as it's ever going to be, but I will go over the whole thing just for consistency. One thing to be careful of in the transition between the wood and the resin, there's always just, you know, a little sort of hairline gap there, and then there could be other cracks elsewhere. When you get to the middle wheel, the middle wheel is a white abrasive, and that gets into anywhere that it can get into, and it can be quite hard to get back out again. So, you know, if you don't want to highlight those lines, then, you know, maybe just be careful with that white one. So anyway, I'll run through this. I'll speed it up on the video, and I'll do the first two and get to the wax. Between these two, I am going to take this in. I'm going to wash it properly with soapy water, let it dry, because I don't want this abrasive on when I'm using this wheel. So before we move on to the final stage, the polishing, I do want to just cover A couple of things when you're using the buffing wheels. First thing is, it can pull a piece out of your hand. With a sphere, it's not so bad, but if you're using a bowl or a plate or anything, just keep a tight hold. When you're using resin on a sphere, something like this, don't push on too hard. Don't get too much friction. Don't get too much heat. You can actually sort of ripple the surface. I guess it just gets hot enough that it remelts the surface. And also with the resin, I find don't put too much wax on, and then sort of work towards the wood. So work away onto the wood. Otherwise, you could actually get deposits of wax, sort of, which you see really clearly on the resin. You don't see it so much on the wood. This is where the crack was, and I put some CA glue on. I'm hoping that's going to disappear. If not on a sort of proper piece that I would do, I would actually sand that right back down and start again. But let's put a little bit of wax on there and get this one finished. So again, if this was a commercial piece, I'd be doing a few things. I'd be giving this a good wipe down, leaving it probably overnight, and then waxing it again just to let it harden. But hopefully you can see that's come out pretty nicely. You can see, actually, yeah, you can see where the crack is, but I don't think it's that noticeable. The black walnuts just is always so nice to turn. The transitions have come out well. There's a little bit of haze in the resin there. I've been having some issues with the Illuminite resin recently. I don't know if it's a humidity issue or not. But anyway, that's how I go through all the steps, and that's how I finish them. Hopefully this is helpful. And if you have any questions, actually, if you have any advice, if you see me doing something and you think there's a better way of doing it, always open to feedback from the community. So hope that was worth your time, and enjoy. Thanks.